So we got a great panel of experts for you in the home stretch here, and going to have a really great conversation. Many of you know the name W.D. Farr. He's a visionary water pioneer from Greeley, and we're told that Mr. Farr in the 1960s said, "We will come to a time when we have to cooperate. That will be the only way." And that quote's right up there for you to see. We brought these experts together to really have a rich conversation around that idea. And then we're going to facilitate a dialogue and perhaps kick it out to you for some additional information. So the first presenter we're going to have is Jennifer Gimbel, who's with the Colorado Water Center at CSU. Please welcome Jennifer.
Good morning, and I want to thank you all very much for inviting me here. I just came from Water Congress in Denver, and so as I was driving down, I didn't know how many people I were going to see. And man, you guys rock. This is great to see so many people involved in these conversations. My topic is climate change, Colorado River, and the Poudre River. So this study just came out, and this is what we're looking at with respect to climate change. We expect that we're going to have higher temperatures up to 3 degrees in the next 25 years. Look at the state of Colorado there. You can see how much warmer it's getting. Might be getting a little colder in the mountains, but it is going to be warmer. Well, what does that mean? That means less snowpack, more rain, increased water demand for crops, earlier runoff, and decreased stream flows, be it the Poudre River, the Arkansas, the Rio Grande, or the Colorado River. That's what we're looking at. Just a small amount of increase in temperature can really wreak havoc on a stream. You've got more evaporation, your crops need more because of the heat, and so that's what we're looking at with respect to our future. Now let's connect this with the Colorado River. This is a picture that describes the compact on the Colorado River. We agreed, under Farr's example, we agreed with the other basin states on how to divvy up the Colorado River. That was for our protection. Lower Basin was developing faster. We have an upper basin obligation of, you see here, 7.5 million acre feet annually. Now that's not a delivery obligation. That just means we cannot deplete those flows below that. And really in the compact, it's a 10-year running average, 75 million acre feet. So that's what we agreed to. And also we have an obligation to Texas. Why should you here in the Poudre River care about that? This is why. This is a map. This is a piece of a map from the Bureau of Reclamation. You see the Colorado River Basin boundaries there. These are all the areas that depend on the Colorado River. Municipalities and ag producers all together. We have a huge dependence. There's 500,000 acre feet of Colorado River water that comes over here to the east slope. If the Colorado River runs into trouble, the state runs into trouble. This is an average of flows. You can see a bar chart that goes from 1905 up to about, to 2010. And you can see this steady decline of flows on the Colorado River. Brad Udall, also part of the Colorado Water Center, just released a study that said that there was a 19% of reduction in flows, in supplies on the Colorado River just in the last 14 years. Just in the last 14 years. And if things continue as they are, we are going to see a 35% reduction in the flows of the Colorado River by the end of the century. So that's a wake-up call, and has been with respect to the basin states. The Colorado River has been in drought for a solid, now this is 19 years this year. And it doesn't look any better. Many of you know the drought monitor. I picked this up January 15th. Look at Colorado. Not just the Colorado River. Look at Colorado. We are, 90% of the state is anywhere from abnormally dry to, boy, are we in trouble. That's what we're looking at. But the basin states have come together again. Your people from Colorado here, our representatives representing the governor and the Attorney General's office, have put together a plan to help the upper basin ride that drought. That plan is called the Drought Contingency Plan. And it's made up of 3 basic properties. One is weather modification and actually phreatophyte removal. It doesn't give us a lot, but we're at a point where everything helps. Another one is drought operations of the federal reservoirs. That would be for us like Blue Mesa, that whole unit, Flaming Gorge, Lake Navajo Dam. So if we can manipulate those reservoirs in a certain way, that can help us sustain flows on the Colorado River. And finally, demand management. I don't know if you've had a chance to talk about that much here, but we have to figure out a way to put flows in the river, in the Colorado River. We have an obligation to see water goes down to the lower basin. And so we're looking at how can we do that? We're looking at what's been called a system conservation pilot program. Would it work to fallow land? Would that get back into the river? That's proven that it can, but not to the degree that's needed. So your Colorado representative, CWCB, Jim Yon is your representative on that board, are working on a plan to move forward with discussions about demand management. Why do you care here in the Poudre? This is an important discussion. It's an important discussion not just for the Colorado River, but to sustain all of our rivers. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you, Jennifer. Next, we have Patrick McMeekin. He's with Hartford Homes and going to talk about affordable housing and the price of water on the Poudre. Please welcome Patrick.
Great. Good afternoon. Happy Friday, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm going to discuss tonight the price of water and its effect on affordable housing. So if anybody has been tracking Fort Collins' readoption of their city plan and that new process, one of the constant topics that keeps coming up is affordable housing and how we plan to deliver that in the future. Well, water, the cost of water and the availability of water have a significant impact on that. And so we're going to talk about that today. This is a quote I've seen numerous times in a lot of books, but I'm not entirely certain who originated this, but it says, water will flow uphill to money. So when you have a willing buyer, willing seller market, that tends to drive that price up. So today what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about water as a function of the cost of a home. So I'm going to break down a cost of a house we're currently building in Northeast Fort Collins, and how does the price of water relate in that equation? Second is water as a function of a cost of a project. So in certain areas, from a development standpoint, we're required to go onto the open market, buy water, and bring it in to serve our projects. There's a substantial cost to doing that. And then lastly, we'll talk about larger, more macro issues that are affecting affordability. So notes for today's discussion. Different cities and different potable service providers have different policies and dedication rates. There is no standard across all of the municipalities or districts we work in, so they're very different. An example today, like I talked about, is going to assume we have to bring 100% of what we call wet water. So water we go out and buy on the market, and we do not purchase from the city, we buy ourselves. Most municipal valuations, so if we can buy water from a city, it's called cash in lieu. Most of that is based on the price of CBT. And in addition, other water rights on the Poudre track closely to the price of CBT, but those adjustments can lag a couple of years. So what you're gonna see today from me is today's pricing in the CBT market. I found out on the way here that I'm actually light by about $2,000 a unit, so the price has already gone up from my presentation. But cities tend to follow that rate and that amount as they set their policies. And then lastly, policy changes can have significant impacts on home building. So if you're working within a district that has a cash in lieu rate and changes to a dedication policy where you have to bring wet water, that's a significant impact on development and ultimately the price of housing. So this is a chart of historic CBT pricing. So 2009 is on your left end, 2019 is on the right end. This is the price of CBT as a per acre foot basis. So as you may know, a CBT share delivers 7/10 of an acre foot. So we adjust that upward to get to a full acre foot. You can see it's increased 5 times in the last 10 years. Okay, so the assumptions for our discussion today. We're gonna assume that the price of the CBT share is $38,500. I think, like I indicated earlier, that's light by about $2,000 from what I heard on the phone today. But for today's purposes, that's about what it is. From a pure per acre foot perspective, that's $55,000 for an acre foot of water. 7/10 of an acre foot for a CBT share, adjust to $55,000 for a full acre foot. Average single family house that we are seeing is about a half an acre foot per house. There are changes in that based on if you have a townhome, if you have a non-potable irrigation system, a large percentage of a house utilizes, the water is utilized to irrigate the lawn, that can ratchet down. But in this scenario, we're not talking about that. We're just talking about a traditional scenario. This is the interesting thing to this. This is a very small lot we are developing on. This is a 3,600 square foot lot right now. So again, this is a project we're building in Northeast Fort Collins. Many people may have houses that are 3,600 square feet. The lot is 3,600 square feet. And this house is 1,600 square feet, 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, 2-car attached garage, 9-foot basement. This is the picture. So if you drive to our community called Mosaic in Northeast Fort Collins, you'll see these houses. It's an alley-loaded product. It's got a lot of great character, curb appeal, 1,600 square feet, 3,600 square foot lot. Okay, this is the breakdown of the costs of that house. Land cost from a paper lot perspective is $25,000. That's the real estate value of the lot you're buying. Then there is a value or a cost to construct that: water, sewer, streets, common area landscaping, amenities for the community. That's $55,000. The raw water component of that house is $27,500. We'll come back to that in a second. Permits and fees, $45,057. So this project is being developed in the Elko district and the Box Elder district and the city of Fort Collins. So when you layer the raw water and the permit and fees, we're about $72,000 for this house. Hard construction costs, so these are your sticks and bricks, about $199,000. 30 separate components make up this. So the important takeaway from this is the largest single component we have in a house is our framing package. And that framing and labor package is about $28,000. So you'll see the price of water is now approaching the single biggest individual line item in a house. And then we work our way down: real estate commissions, closing costs, interest, loan fees, soft costs, and ultimately profit. It's a 5% gross margin for anybody who's doing or net margin for anybody who's doing the math. So not a real get-rich-quick scheme. And then lastly, that equates to the sales price. So 1,600 square foot house, 3,600 square foot lot. That's how we arrive at a $427,000 sales price today. Okay, so now let's look at that as a function of a project. So that house is within this community here. This community is called Mosaic. Again, southeast corner of Vine and Timberline. This community makes up 870 total units. There's varying products within this, from traditional single family to the small product we just looked at, to townhomes, to apartments. But again, this is a typical scale development you'll see in the city of Fort Collins. It's on 148 acres. So the water needs for this project, so we assume a half acre foot a unit. So when we have to dedicate water for a project, we have to dedicate for each individual lot and all of the common areas that we plan to irrigate within the project. So that number will vary. It will go down for townhomes and apartments and go up for larger single-family lots. But on average, it's about a half acre foot across the project. What that tells us is we need 435 acre feet to serve that project. That equates to having to go out in the market and buy 621 CBT units to serve that project. That is the acquisition price today for 621 CBT units, $24 million. So I'm going to put that in perspective for you. When you break that down to a per acre price, which is typically what we work on in the world of real estate development, it's $161,000 an acre just for the water, where the real property value is $40,000. So the price of the water is 4x the price of acquiring the real estate. When we had Zach up here with his ranch model, and farmers are the investment and the cash flow people, we're slightly less intelligent investment cash flow people from the development perspective. But the reality this brings into how we work is, are you going to spend $24 million day one on your project to know that you have the water? You will not make an IRR work in that scenario. So the investment decision you have to make going forward is, am I willing to start a project knowing that I don't have all the water to satisfy and serve the project? And is that a risk I'm willing to take? As the availability of water becomes more difficult to find, that decision becomes more and more difficult today. So where that affects us is, we are already undersupplying the market. We could further undersupply the market with this level. And lastly, here's some more macro issues affecting the market today. So Colorado's population is going to exceed 8 million by 2050. It's 2.5 million people. We've heard that over and over today. 7 of the 10 fastest growing communities in Colorado in northern water service area. Competition is stiff. This is probably one of the biggest issues we've seen. We're competing with water rights for not only individual cities. I mean, I've lost to Roy's City twice over the last 3 months trying to purchase a water right. But we're also seeing competition from our South Metro builders, our South Weld County builders, Erie, Frederick, Firestone, and the metro area. There are metro area providers up in our water Poudre River Basin market acquiring rights right now. That has all driven the cost up. The end of CBT. I think we are approaching a point where we can predict the end of CBT being an available supply of water for development. The folks in Northern Water would tell you that they're converting about 1% of their water every year into municipal and industrial. They would also tell you that 20% of their shares will ultimately remain in ag, and that really gives 10% to work with. So we now have a very predictable path to the end of CBT being utilized as a source. And then lastly, we can always recreate new lots. We can't recreate new water. So when we talk about constraints on the market, this is going to be a big constraint and ultimately has an impact moving forward. So the last thing I want to show you is, this is a map of the Tri-Districts area. So the blue is Elko, the green is North Weld, and the orange is Fort Collins Loveland Water Sanitation District. So the reason I show this to you is, this boundary here are districts that require some form of water dedication with a development perspective. So all of the impacts we talked about today make this a more difficult task. There are different policies. Some require 50% of the water to be dedicated, and you can pay for 50%. But it ultimately affects the affordability, and this map is very dynamic. 1 year ago, this map would have looked different. It would have included Greeley, and it would have excluded North Weld. That's how fast things are changing. Thank you.
Thank Thank you, Patrick. So your program has our next presenter as Christy Melendez, who had a conflict, so we've got the next best thing, which is Shane Hale. He's the town manager for the town of Windsor, so please welcome Shane.
Thank you. Okay, thanks. So yeah, I am Shane Hale, and I did kind of get the last minute call to stand in for the mayor, and I'm so happy to share the stage with so many great people and people engaged with water. None less than Roy Otto. I always love sharing the stage with Roy because comparatively I look young, fit, and good looking. So thank you, Roy. So I'm going to talk a little bit today just about the town's dual use system. I'm going to kind of show you guys the benefits of what we've seen for usage and then kind of finish with a discussion on the benefits of the system. So a little bit of history. Water Valley became the first development to propose a dual use system. And at the time, Martin Lind had proposed it kind of in trade for bringing that in, that he be allowed to just dedicate 1/3 of the raw water to the town and pay 1/3 of the planned investment fee. Staff took a look at that and determined really, it was for the raw water standpoint, it was about a 50-50 exchange. So about half of our water goes to outdoor watering, half is indoor use, and that's ultimately what we adopted. We operated under this model for almost a decade, and I think the town saw the point, especially with the development in Water Valley, how well it worked, kind of the lower reliance on our domestic product. And so ultimately we passed an ordinance in 2003 to kind of make this in effect for the rest of the community. So the ordinance mandates it for any new construction in our water service area. You have to have a non-pot system. All these systems are privately managed, so the metro districts or HOAs have full responsibility not only for building them, but for maintaining them. As far as establishing geographical areas, basically we took a map of our whole town and our urban growth boundary and determined any of the historical irrigated wetlands, any of the irrigated farms, or any of the areas that had a non-pot use with them. As they develop, that non-potable use goes into the non-potable system. And then obviously with annexation, the only way to annex into the town is if you bring in a dual use system. So what we've seen with our numbers are the kind of line going upward trajectory is the theme that's come up a few times about Windsor already today, which is we've had a lot of growth in the last few years. And then the thing that kind of looks like my retirement fund right now that's going down has been our water use. It's kind of hard to peg that, but basically our high water use, our gallons per day per person is basically 180 gallons per day is where we started. Right now we're at about 110 gallons per day on a per capita use. And in our Old Town area, as we see people replace their fixtures and kind of get more into water conservation mode, we do see those numbers continuing to go down. The benefits, I think, are pretty obvious to anybody in here what a dual use system could bring. Obviously, more water in the ditches that help out the ditch companies, the ag users. It stretches our capacity. We're not treating the water to then just put it on Kentucky bluegrass somewhere. It reduces our peaking demand, so the town pays less for the water. Obviously, it keeps it in the river as well. And then, like I mentioned before, the environmental benefits of not putting all the treated potable water on a plant that couldn't care less. And then there's a couple other benefits I think that I would point out. One is it's moved the responsibility, at least a lot of the responsibility, to the development community. Kind of like what Patrick was talking about. When you need to provide basically 50% of the water for the development to even come in to treat all your non-potable uses, I think it's kind of a shared responsibility. It's also given more awareness to the homeowners. A lot of these homeowners have their own meters, so they know kind of what they're putting on the water outside versus what's going on inside. Also, like Patrick mentioned, with the cost of CBT, they call it the gold standard. And I think a big reason for that is because at $36,000 an acre foot, it's like, it kind of feels like gold, right? I mean, it's really expensive. So it's nice to take that water and just use it for potable uses and use these other sources for non-pot. And then finally, and I think kind of the theme of the Windsor side is how do we keep up, how's this helped out with our big growth, right? How's this non-potable system as a policy helped out with big growth? I would tell you, another project we've talked about today is NISP. And so from the town side, we're on the hook for 3,300 acre feet, and that's going to be about $100 million. So just doing the math, if we needed twice as much water for that growth, that would be 6,600 acre feet or $200 million. So, I'm just appreciative that the town has it in place, because I think clearly it's really helped with our planning yield and really how much we need to build out. So, thank you.
Thank you, Shane. So our next presenter is LeRoy Off. Did I pronounce that right? LeRoy Off, and he's with Department of Biology at Colorado State University. So please welcome LeRoy.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with people who care about the Poudre River and the future of the Poudre River and recognize the challenges of developing a sustainable management plan for the Poudre River. I am a river ecologist at Colorado State University, and I'm going to talk to you today through the lens of a scientist. The title that was given to this section was rather long, and I can't even repeat it, but it has something to do with a working river and how do we maintain a working river. And I want to talk about the health of the Poudre River and sort of what some of the challenges are for the coming years. So this is a painting of the Poudre River in 1871, sort of an idealized kind of painting, but you can see that beautiful setting, and that's what many people who came to Colorado first encountered when they saw the Poudre River. In the 150 years or so since that time, a lot has changed. So, for example, the native fishes that here on the far right that occur in the Poudre River, many of them, about half of them, are either extinct or severely threatened, just barely hanging in there. The river's been highly altered in terms of the hydrograph, of course. Lots of other insults, urbanization, we've heard a lot about. And more development is going to hasten the decline of the river. That's sort of inevitable. So we have to take some kind of action if we want to sustain the river in some kind of, to provide amenities and benefits to people who enjoy using it and to the species that live there. Likewise, many of you will know that the floodplains, which historically spring flood would come down the river and overbank and sustain cottonwood forests and that kind of thing. The floodplains have been severely restricted from access to the river through levees and riprap that keeps the channel stable and so forth. So that's another big change, and that's what we have today. That's the legacy that we are working with in thinking about how do we move forward in maintaining a healthy Poudre River. Well, so I guess the question is, can we maintain or improve the ecological health of the Poudre River? And so here's the Poudre watershed on the left. When looking at that, sort of struck at how similar that looks to Australia, but a lot of the same problems. And I actually work in Australia quite a bit on environmental watering, environmental flows issues. And as was mentioned in Ed Barbier's keynote earlier today, there's a really big difference. I mean, we have the same problems, but here we really have what could be called the vicious water cycle, where we're acting as if there is no limitation, and we sort of don't have the institutional structure to sort of break out of that. And clearly a big challenge for the future is how do we as individual citizens and what non-governmental institutions have the ability to cooperate and bring the river into, allow water for the river itself, not just for these other, many important needs that the river is serving. And in Australia, really, it's more the virtuous water cycle because there's a sort of integrated government from local to federal, and it's a very different kind of system, as many of you will know. So, just a little aside there. It's an interesting contrast. When we think about the river, the city of Fort Collins has done a lot of work to evaluate the river and its health and so forth, and we can think about the different sort of functions that the river provides as we go from headwaters out onto the plains. And of course, a really big one is agriculture. And there's a lot of concern about the future of agriculture, of course, and rightly so. But how do we measure a healthy river? So the city, for example, and I've been involved with a lot of these city efforts, we can think about a reference kind of condition, which would be that 1871 painting, highly functioning, or functionally impaired. And we're sort of in this area right now, sort of in this area. And so the point is we'll never go back to a reference. Very few people are arguing that. But we don't want to become, we don't want the river to move into a functionally impaired, non-functioning kind of status. And so can we do that? Well, it's not going to happen by itself. That's going to require a lot of collaboration. A variety of factors constitute the health of a river. I'm not going to go into that. Come take my course at CSU if you're interested. So the city developed a report card for different parts of the river, from canyon down to plains. This is through the Fort Collins Reach mostly. And the main thing to notice here is that the colors get redder as we go to the right, so the river becomes more impaired, more challenged. The other thing to notice, the water quality is pretty good throughout the river, based on the scale. Flow regime gets really hammered as we go out through Fort Collins, and riparian condition also declines quite a bit. So these are our big challenges. So the river is impaired and sensitive to further degradation. So we're at a point, I think, in the river where it's on sort of a tipping point, and we have to be careful about how we go forward. So what does the future hold? Well, one of the ways to look at that was a group that I participated in that developed an ecological response model for the river, and basically looked at a variety of future scenarios of water supply, including climate change and further water development, and then tried to look at the what's happening at the reach scale. It translates into things like fish and riparian and so forth. And I don't want to belabor this. The main thing I want to point out, which you won't be surprised about, since we're talking about water here in the Poudre River, is that the hydrograph is really key to maintaining high function of the Poudre River. And here's a typical, the annual hydrograph, right, with low, medium, and high flows. And we can relate these flows to ecological functions. So, we have wetted habitat for fish and, trout. Higher flows move the bed to clean, rejuvenate the bed. We get overspilling onto the floodplain, which helps rejuvenate riparian vegetation. Then as we decline, the flows decline, we end up with low flows that are important in the winter here for things like brown trout juveniles. And so what we have now is a very much reduced winter runoff, right? I mean, that's what's serving all the agriculture on the plains, for example. So here's a map that shows the diversions along the Poudre River from the canyon out to Greeley, and right in Fort Collins there's a huge amount of diversion. That's what has created, of course, this reduced hydrograph, right? And so this has ecological consequences. And now we have to think about, what about the future? Okay, so the big challenge for the river in the future right now is NISP and the construction of Glade Reservoir. If that goes forward, will be a 170,000 acre-foot reservoir. Will be slightly larger than Horsetooth, and based on some numbers that the city has crunched, what we can see is the projected changes in flow with NISP will be for runoff. This is the peak, sort of the peak season. At the Canyon Mouth Gauge, the Larimer Well diversion, and Lincoln Street Gauge and Box Elder, there will be a decline of 15 to 25% in peak flows on average. So that's going to further reduce this peak flow that we currently experience for the river. So that's going to mean, so it's going to translate into reduced riparian function, for example, and a variety of other sort of infrastructure issues that the city's concerned about, having to do with things like floodway clearance and so forth, that might be reduced if there aren't big scouring flows, but that's another story. Interestingly, and this is with the proposed mitigation, with the proposed mitigation, the winter flows would actually increase due to some supplementation by NISP, but that can all be arranged. And we see the actual increase in base flows through Fort Collins in the winter, but once we get out to Box Elder to the interstate, those winter flows are going to really go down. So if you're out of Greeley, you can expect a lot of highly reduced winter flows in the future. So these reduced overbank flows will lead to some channel narrowing. We might switch to from riparian species to more non-native species, riparian, and encroachment into the channel of vegetation, which will reduce maybe increase the flood resistance during big flows. There's a lot of uncertainty, of course. So what's next? Well, there are also other future projects being considered in the Poudre. So Halligan Reservoir on the North Fork here, and Siemens up on the main stem. Okay, so really a question I think we have to face from a scientific perspective is, the Poudre River, we'd like to call it a working river, right? But what are the criteria that we say, when are we working it to death? And the reality is that the river actually needs water. It's also, because of our regulations and our water law, the institutions to provide water to the Poudre River are limited. So that requires some, sort of citizen cooperation and efforts to maintain the river flows that are maybe some of that cooperation that Mr. Farr talked about in the opening quote of this session. Okay, and how do we get to a longer-term solution? Well, during the keynote, Mencken was quoted as saying, for every complex problem, there's a simple solution, and it's probably wrong, and it doesn't have to be wrong. And as a scientist, I'm also a citizen, so I'm going to propose my simple solution. And I don't think it's wrong, but I don't know if it's doable. That is, let's water our river corridors and not our lawns. And that's really sort of a social decision that is very diffuse. It's not going to be mandated. But I noticed in the low-income housing pictures for Fort Collins there, those small houses had nice zero-scaped lawns, and that's really a source of water that we need to think about drawing on in order to maintain the viability and the vitality of the Poudre River. So with that, I'd like to thank you and be glad to take any questions.
LeRoy, so pinch hitting is Shane's less handsome, Roy Otto with City of Greeley. So please join me in welcoming Roy.
Thank you. So we'll talk later, Shane. So I'd submit to you that water is northern Colorado's most important shared economic, environmental, and livability building block. The question is, with what heart set are we going to utilize this important resource? This is a critical question because I believe when the chips are down, we actually act out of our heart set and not our mindset. And right now, the chips are down in northern Colorado water. We're going to have to collaborate, folks, or the resource will leave the Poudre Basin. So, are we going to focus on water wars? Or are we going to focus on living waters? Come on, clicker. There we go. This, I believe, is our responsibility to develop collaborative solutions that address regional water scarcity and promote vibrant economy, a productive agriculture, and healthy working rivers. A quick review of the water provider landscape seems to reflect that others agree that water is a pretty darn important resource because there are so many involved. There are a lot of denominators. More on that later. Here is just a quick map of some of our major ditch companies. And here is a map of our major water providers, complete with their water treatment plants And as we've heard today, Thornton is now one of Northern Colorado's water providers. Here are the number of water reservoirs that exist and or are in the permitting process. Those are some pretty big numerators. So, water is a shared resource, but water planning is disjointed amongst these people at best. And then complicating planning efforts are inherent, divergent, and competing values of growth versus agriculture versus in-stream flows versus so many other things that we heard here today. Let me share with you just two examples of my personal journey into this area of conflict. So I feel blessed to be Greeley's city manager, and many would call Greeley the state capital of agriculture. Yet, as I learned more and more about our long-term water planning, one of our biggest solutions was buy and dry. So how do I build a collaborative working relationship with one of the largest sectors in our economy if at the end of the day I'm looking at them and saying I want to buy the major resource that helps them be viable? I don't think that's sustainable at the end of the day. So I'm a Greeley boy, moved to Greeley when I was in the 9th grade. I competed in track and cross country and basketball for a year with the majority of the other sons of Northern Colorado, and let's face it, I wanted to win. I became very, very competitive, and when I moved back to Greeley, Colorado in 1999 as the assistant city manager, and then 2005 as the city manager, I saw that same competitive mindset. And if anybody was getting in the way of Greeley and her long-term water plans, they were the competition, and I didn't necessarily have a very collaborative mindset. For that, I apologize. And I ask honestly for your forgiveness, because that's not the correct heart set to have for Northern Colorado, who ultimately raised me, because I graduated from CSU as well. So, I fear we're set up to focus on self and water. We think that water is mine, mine, mine.
Mine.
Okay, don't make any sudden moves. Hop inside my mouth if you want to live.
Hop in your mouth, huh? And how does that make me live?
Mine?
Because I can take you to your son.
Yeah, right.
No, I know your son. He's orange. He's got a gimpy fin on one side.
That's leaving!
Fasten your seatbelts!
A lot of fun, huh? So I'd submit we're at a crossroads in water, and we have a choice as to which heart set with which we want to move forward. The mine, mine, mine heart set leads to water wars. To your tents, guns and ammo, gentlemen. We've heard about that today. This heart set focuses on self and the scarcity of our water resources. That heart set extracts value and creates winners and losers. Or we can have a living water heart set that sees abundance in our water resources gained through collaboration. This heart set creates value and establishes win-win situations. Notice the vulnerability in the Mine, Mine, Mine video. Go it alone and get eaten, or jump back in the pelican's mouth and live. If you're anything like me, you can feel the tension between a self-orientation and an others orientation. Any 2 points of tension, you can put a rope and tie it to both ends, and you have a tight rope. And we feel rather vulnerable as we walk across the tightrope. And when you're the last speaker standing between how many hundreds of people and beer, you feel super vulnerable, just like walking across a tightrope in a kilt. So let me suggest that we must co-create solutions by being vulnerable, and sometimes being vulnerable makes us feel like we're herding cats. Hey, the good thing is that we have been vulnerable in our past, and we have been cat herders in our past. Here are a few examples of those successes that we've heard a little bit about today. There are a lot more and not enough time to talk about those. Here are some other ideas of things that I think we should be thinking about as we move into the future. Water planning in the future should be informed by our past, but also incorporate evolving values of NOCO, residents in the areas of ecology and recreation. Just as regional entities cooperate on land use and transportation planning, I would submit to you that we should also challenge ourselves to think regionally about water. My challenge to my staff as they prepare for our long-term future is to think as if they are the water provider of northern Colorado as we look to solve Greeley's long-term needs, because I don't believe that us looking just at our individual needs that will actually be successful, and I believe it'll hurt the region as a whole. Water supply development projects should be graded if they yield water, yes, but also enhance in the environmental health and sustain agriculture. Could the region invest in an expansive, non-potable water supply system in Greeley, including maybe even replumbing sections of Greeley, Colorado? This idea keeps water in the river, not only in the Fort Collins reach, but all the way to the confluence, benefiting many. So as I reflect, I really believe that it's living waters that are our most important building block. Living water is the use of water resource in collaboration with Northern Colorado water providers, ag users, environmental and recreational interests. We are facing complicated and expensive water needs. We are better together than apart. So, big numerators and small denominators make projects more expensive across the per capita cost of a project. But if we address those large projects by all of us, we're able to lower those costs for everybody. Now, I'm not saying you have to share my faith, but I would like to show you this picture because I think it is a very powerful picture for a collaborative heart set that wants to benefit all with living waters. So again, I think this is our challenge. If you are willing to examine your heart set, become vulnerable and connect with others, maybe some who you even believe are your enemy, and risk a few scratches, as we heard cats, you heard it, but you didn't see it, then please give the city of Greeley, Colorado a call, because we would like to collaborate with you to see Northern Colorado's future be a collaborative future that benefits all. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. So we are going to have a facilitated conversation up here. I'm going to kick it off, and then we may kick it out to all of you. So think about your questions. We have microphones up here for our great panelists. So I'll start it off. I have a confession. I own bluegrass. I have 2 kids. I don't know where the .3 came in. It was just the heat of the moment. We like playing in the grass. We play wiffle ball. We got a slippy slide in the summertime. It's a real enjoyable part of our quality of life. My sense is others feel the same way, and I would imagine that markets drive that. However, what we heard was between climate change and other management activities, the Colorado River is going to be a future challenge for us, and that's a big part of the Poudre Basin in northern Colorado. We also heard that CBT availability is continuing to decline, which is really the one of the big resources to be able to develop these landscapes for homes. We also heard that water is a significant piece of the overall cost of a home. Are we getting to a point where the marketplace will start asking communities and at the development community and speaking in the marketplace that they want less of this bluegrass that's driving some of the water challenges? And/or can cities promote for or incentivize ways to use less water outdoors and get involved in the marketplace?
You know, from a development perspective, we're always trying to solve towards an in-sales price, right? Because when we move into a territory that we can't sell homes, there's really no reason to develop them, right? So we're always trying to solve for that end price. And largely, when I showed that list of inputs into costs, there's not a lot in there that's dynamic, that can change. The original land acquisition price can change. And with density, you can flex some of your water and infrastructure costs. So when you look at those items, you start to realize that if you do want to own a house, you're going to be dealing with something that's probably different than a 12,000 square foot lot with 8,000 square feet of bluegrass, just because you can't afford that. That example there you saw, that grass that was in the picture was the only grass on the lot. What you didn't see is rock and xeriscaping down the sides of the house and in the rear lot. So that is absolutely where everything is moving from our perspective and a land use perspective.
So talk to you a little bit about the issue of being the state capital of ag, and we are kicking around ideas of, hey, should we buy and dry Greeley first before we look at buying and drying agriculture? And that means buying up and changing some of the landscape that you're talking about. And I found it interesting as we went through here recently extension of 2 taxes in Greeley that we call Imagine Greeley. Some of the surveying we did there, folks definitely resonate with the importance of agriculture. And my guess is that they see the trade-off and they understand that ag is probably a necessity, whereas some of the bluegrass and things along those lines around their yard is more of an amenity. And I wonder what it might look like if all of northern Colorado did something along those lines and then set aside a portion of that water to maintain a viable agricultural economy in northern Colorado, and also use some of those flows, maybe going down the river to Greeley, to irrigate the now minimal landscaping from the past, but still we want to be irrigating with non-treated water supplies, which will keep water in the river. And I think people see the importance of that river and those open space areas as well as a part of why they're buying into communities, not just bluegrass to have their kids play on.
Anyone else want to add to that?
I guess my comment to that would be that Ed Barbier mentioned 2-tier water pricing. So, I mean, that's the actual value of water is something that I don't think we've really dealt with very well. And I mean, if I ask people to raise their hands, which I won't do, how many people think that water is unlimited in Colorado, which has been sort of our mindset for a long time? I don't think anybody would raise their hand. So the question is, what do we want to do to fill that gap in the water plan? You know, what's the vision? What's the collective interest of our society? And you know, the health of the river, certainly that's what I'm going to advocate for, but that's just one piece of it. But I don't think we have a very good institutions for actually, you know, getting people's ideas as to how we want to go forward and then moving on that. And it's partly because of the legacy of our, you know, our legal system and so forth. So water scarcity is here, and you know, we have to decide how we want to use our water, because we're not going to get more.
All right, we're going to kick it out to you guys. Question or comment?
My question relates to water conservation. And one of the big challenges we've had in Windsor for water conservation has been how to deal with an HOA. The HOAs seem to have a structure that comes down to each one of them. And when we try to talk to them, get them together, meet their manager, call and leave a message, we get nowhere. And so maybe my question is, and I want to get your name right, to Patrick, how do we break that HOA barrier?
That's a great question. You know, one of the tools that we utilize in most communities and beginning to explore them in Fort Collins is what's called a metropolitan district, which is a largely more regulated homeowners association. It operates under the Special Districts Act and tends to be more responsive and a reliable source for that. The second is, I think you have to start addressing that issue with a tiered rate structure in terms of water use, right? You're not going to get their attention unless it's a painful irrigation bill. And I don't know a better way to say it, but then to change their mindset. And so to have a tiered rate structure where you're discouraging the inefficiencies in that largely irrigation system. But also on the flip side of that, we want to be designing those common area amenity spaces within the HOAs, not to be big turf fields either. We do want to design those to be a large part of turf xeriscape components, because that is still water that we have to buy and bring to the market from a development and cost perspective. So I think there's two sides of that, but metro districts seem to be better tools from our standpoint.
I just thought I'd note that one of the laws that's been passed in the last few years allows people in HOAs to go to xeriscaping without being penalized. And so the whole purpose of that was to allow that kind of conservation within the HOAs. And now that law, there's an amendment to that law. I don't know if it's passed yet or not, but it's expanding it to certain water districts so that individuals are not penalized when they want to do their own water conservation.
I'd like to touch on your point a bit, because we agree with that xeriscape mentality. We see that some of our homeowners want to do that, but the flip side of that is we actually don't see a dedication benefit on the raw water side yet to do that. And so the districts that we work in will say, look, in the future, somebody could tear that out and turns it to grass. So we still need to have this level of dedication. So there's a mechanism there to help solve that. But exactly.
Come develop in Greeley, because we want to partner with you on some demonstration neighborhoods in that regard, and model and see whether or not we can have lower dedication requirements because of a different landscaping code. And we will be vulnerable with you. You know that water providers want certainty. We're going to step outside of that certainty to see if we can be a petri dish for the benefit of northern Colorado in that regard. So come build some homes in Greeley.
Is there a question over here?
Yeah, along that same lines, you said there was an average of a half-acre foot for single-family homes. I was curious if you had a number for like townhomes or larger lot homes, and then there's sort of two-part question where you have indoor water use and outdoor water usage. So if you increase density, you're going to have more indoor water usage. You're going to have more people per density per acre, right? So is there? I want to know if there's a tipping point maybe between that outdoor water usage getting reduced enough that the increase in density of indoor water usage would would offset that indoor water usage to be sustainable.
Well, I would just say, because we have a dual use system in Windsor, we actually calculate the indoor water use at 0.29 of an acre foot. So we've actually broken that out, and so we know kind of the indoor residential use versus outdoor use. So we do have that multiplier, and you want to hit the risk for?
Yeah, I think where we're seeing that change too is just general lot size. When you have the example we showed of a 40 by 90 lot, you are just by the nature of the product you're delivering, substantially reducing the amount of water you're putting on your lawn, and thus normalizing also, or slightly more normalizing the amount of water that moves through that house. I think the districts in here and potable water providers will tell you that the variability in water is probably the hardest thing they have to deal with. And when you move into a smaller lot size in that indoor use only model, you actually now start to have a more predictable demand on your system. So
I'll tell you what, I am seeing some pictures of houses that go on and on and on. Really big mega houses for about 2 people. And this just does seem nuts, because you can have a really nice, well-planned house and you don't have to be all over the block. What can we do? Would it be, the city people, could we limit the mega mansions, because they are on mega lots and they have big yards?
Well, I think it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, what we charge for fees, to just kind of to pin in on that, right now in Windsor and in Greeley and in Fort Collins and Loveland and everywhere else, we have a myriad of fees that the people pay to come in. And I think Patrick did a good job of kind of showing those, your water resource fee, your plant investment fee, your sewer fees, your all your building permit, your use tax, your park impact, your street fees. So I think it is going to be a limiting factor over time, because if you really want to curtail growth, you just make it, on paper, really hard to construct somewhere. So I guess there is a way. I just think the political reality is, if somebody has a big lot and they've got a lot of money to build a big house, I don't think that, in Colorado in the West, there's really the political will to say, no, you've got to be this size. So I think the economics are going to limit it more. I think as we charge fees and just the cost to develop those lots go up, I think the economics will limit it a lot more than an artificial policy.
I would say I'm more of a free market individual. I think the market is going to deal with exactly what you're talking about. Are there going to be some folks that can afford something like that and want to do that? Sure. But I honestly believe what you're going to see more and more coming into the marketplace is smaller lots, smaller homes from that standpoint, based upon a lot of the survey data and stuff I've been seeing. But I'm not a developer. Patrick is. I think he'd be a better authority to talk about what the future looks like in housing.
To answer your question maybe a little bit more specifically, we've started to see, we work in all the major northern Colorado cities. For the first time, we've started to see, and Elko really pioneered this, a tiered dedication structure based on lot size. And so what that means is, if you have a lot that is less than 3,500 square feet, you have to bring a substantially less amount of water. If you have a lot that's north of an acre, you've got to bring more water. So it's starting to address that initial upfront cost, and it ultimately does make it more expensive. Now, how the water gets utilized going forward largely probably depends on rate structure and if they're just okay paying what that would be. So, but we do believe that smaller is likely what we will continue to see, at least in the bulk of the product that we would build.
Okay. Afternoon, David Soslowski, the town of Windsor. I think I know some of you up there, but I have a question for Professor Poff. Sir, in your presentation, if I understood kind of what you were getting at, you believe that the Cache la Poudre and maybe the whole watershed is strained today. It sounded like you were suggesting that NISP is not a good idea to prevent further damage. But if you don't add new water to the flows somewhere, then really we probably are built out to the capacity of the river today, and Mr. McMeekin will move to Indiana, I think, or somewhere where it's much wetter. Am I correct in understanding what your point was in your presentation?
I didn't quite get the last bit of your question there, like the last.
Well, it really has to go with development, and if the river is already stressed, right, and we're not adding new water to it by Trans Mountain, then any new development, any new demands on that river are going to push it into what, I can't remember your term, but a grade of D or lower.
Yeah, I think you could think of it as like a zero-sum game at this point. okay? So any more water that's taken from the river is going to have a likely, cause the river to decline more. And so we have to decide, I think, and there have been several studies, many of them funded by the city, but using CSU scientists and federal agency scientists that would support that. So the question is, what do we as a, public, as a society, as a community, want the river to look like? And, there seem to be possible mechanisms for, keeping water in the river, but the politics of that make it very difficult, and the sort of the pain that a lot of people are experiencing from their livelihoods from, lack of water is clearly, it's important. So it's a big challenge, and it's not just a challenge here in the Poudre, it's a challenge in many western rivers and in arid lands around the world, Australia, for example, where, they're trying to tackle that problem. So it's a wicked problem, so-called wicked problem. It doesn't have any simple answers, right? But what I don't think we've done is really consider what do we want the future to look like for the river, and what are the trade-offs? So the Ducks Unlimited, thing earlier. What are the trade-offs? What do we want? What are the trade-offs, and what are we willing to give up in order to, get what we want? So I hope that's an answer to your question.
Thank you. My name's Bob, and I work for Colorado Youth Outdoors. So our mission is to try to get kids connected to the out of doors. And I'm curious, maybe for Patrick, but certainly for the city managers, as we talk about more concrete, asphalt, and then xeriscapes, what maybe goes into consideration for the greenways or the areas that, I know that when folks come to our facility, they're looking for those nice grass areas, and those certainly are the attractive areas for folks to participate and really connect. I assume that we're taking that in consideration, trying to get the next generation further connected to the out of doors, and I would assume that we would need to figure out how to get them either closer to the river corridors or to some of those greenways.
Yeah, that's a great question, because that is a trade-off that we're experiencing. But I think from a land use perspective and in a subdivision design perspective, we're changing that to where we do have smaller product. You're absolutely right, and we have to have smaller product, more density, but we're clustering that density within the communities and then still having large parks within the community. I'll give you an example. We have a project in Timnath right now that's 740 units, and it has and that's on 150 acres. And it's got a lot of the similar product we just talked about here, but centrally located. We have a 6-acre park on the north and south end of the community, connected by a greenway, thinking that in the future, we're gonna likely have people who can walk to a more centrally located park within their community to still experience that. But when they go back to their house is on a substantially smaller lot with less turf. So it's a change in land use planning for sure, and likely is a change in a lot of the land use policies at the city. But that's how we're starting to address some of those changes.
Yeah, I just piggyback on that. I've definitely seen for the subdivisions, and just in my 10 years as town manager, that certainly that cluster concept has gotten to be really popular, and just kind of how we utilize the space in the subdivision. I think more at the municipal level in planning, I can tell you, Roy Otto and I have met and talked about community separators and acquiring open space, and certainly more that happens on the kind of north side of Windsor, because we're in a different county and they have some money to acquire open space and trails, but it's a constant community conversation, and I think it's important. Part of it, I think, is to make our kids and our people, give them that open space. But more than that, I think it's just a self of identity, right? Just part of your identity. I mean, if you're in Greeley, you're proud to be in Greeley, you want to be in Greeley, and you don't want to look across the street and see, somebody from Windsor in their boxers getting their mail. You want to see only other Greeley people in their underwear, or whatever the analogy is. So I think as we plan out and we build out and we try to react to all this growth that's coming our way, I think that this is an important conversation and an important focus financially.
Well, I know we have folks here from the Poudre Learning Center, and your facility is incredible as well. And so I think we need to continue to invest in those opportunities. But you'll see in Greeley is Fort Collins, Loveland, Windsor, everybody is working on trail systems that quite frankly in a lot of instances are following the natural, either river or tributaries into the river that are used then by folks to go to various recreational sites. I think that's probably a healthier way to make sure that kids are playing, getting on their bikes or walking and jogging to various then locations throughout your town where there can be more bluegrass and activities from that standpoint. But then I think when you're at home, maybe having it more xeric, things along those lines, gives you an opportunity to really educate the kids on how important water is at an early age, so we have more folks like those that came here this morning and are taking on this responsibility in the future.
Hello, my name is Chris, and I was just curious for a reflection on a kind of development point of view and also municipality rules as far as coming full circle with developments. There's 300 people here in the room that are fairly engaged, but the rest of the neighborhoods are not, the homeowners, the kids, and we're all siloed. Can we design the neighborhoods or look at aspects of the neighborhoods that, like, say, stormwater runoff, a more natural way to convey that back to the river systems instead of just in tile? See that the neighborhoods are producing a water source, so to speak, their end use, and that flows to the water. That would kind of full circle the picture that people living in those communities could see that they are part of the system. Because right now, I don't think communities know that they're part of this bigger scale.
That's a really neat vision from that standpoint. I think, yes, we could build some of those things into development standards and the like, sure. But I look over at Mary Lou right now, and here's one of the things that I think would be very powerful, and I hope the water providers can come together and help this to be a reality. So we've been blessed with the water literate leaders class. As I've said, I went into it the first year as a water illiterate follower and then came out as a water literate leader. At least that's what the certificate says. But what about our average citizens on a day-to-day basis? What if we had water-savvy citizens? And there were a lot of these types of classes going on around northern Colorado as a whole, and then we use those opportunities to also talk about that we as a region need to solve this problem. It's not a Fort Collins problem, it's not a Greeley problem, etc. It reminds me a little bit of the I-25 project and how that's come together regionally and collaboratively. I want to look for regional collaborative solutions to water as well, and then educate those water-savvy citizens such that they would want to continue to invest in those projects.
So I'm going to tell a quick story. So like a week ago, I was in Grand Lake. I was taking my family ice fishing, and my wife was ecstatic because she loves that kind of thing. So we're driving by Lake Granby, and I say, hey, boys, so this is part of the Colorado Big Thompson. Oh, I should tell you, I'd taken their screens away, so they had to listen to me, so it was a long ride for them. So I started to describe the Colorado Big Thompson project and the fact that, this water is going to get pumped through Alva B. Adams Tunnel and into Estes and then eventually over to town of Windsor. And right now, when you look at this water, you may be drinking that water, maybe in a week, maybe a month, maybe a year, but this water is going to make its way to you. And my 10-year-old looks at me and said, oh, God, we drink lake water? Yeah, that's what you drink. So I think making that connection with our kids and the communities is important because it's a hard conversation to have. I would just say for a development, and this is not a plug for a Windsor development, but I'll tell you right now, with the Rain Dance subdivision that's just going now, a lot of what you're talking about is built into that. There's a lot of orchards. I think it's going to be kind of a self-sustaining community. I think the idea is that they would have orchards and different gardens going on throughout the community. They'll harvest those. You'll go into the local market there and buy crops that were actually grown right in your neighborhood. Also in Windsor, because we have, if you hadn't heard me the last 9 times, the requirement for non-potable systems. So you'll see a lot of raw water and potable water in almost every Windsor subdivision. So I think there's a little bit more of people being cognizant of that because they're living around it. But I agree, we need to do more of that, right? So
Hello, I have a question for Roy and Shane. And just to change the topic from municipal uses of water to industrial, I understand it's probably 4+ million gallons to drill an oil well and probably more to frack an oil well. And I guess historically, oil and gas companies have purchased water from Greeley because it's cheap. What do you see the future of that?
Very little water is provided at all to oil and gas through the city of Greeley at this point. A very small portion of our annual, if you will, water usage is going into situations in the oil and gas industry. So I know at one point, quite frankly, it was a very big revenue stream for us, and it was helping us at a time when we were in drought. And if anybody knows anything about the death spiral of utilities, when we don't use a lot of water, then the price goes up and you're paying more. And so that was actually a blessing during that period of time. But the oil and gas is not using a significant portion of the Greeley water supply by any stretch of the imagination currently.
And thank you, ma'am, for the easy question. I appreciate that. So I'll tell you, as far as I know, the town of Windsor, we don't provide any water to oil and gas. So they have to get that somewhere else, some other supplies. So they are not our clients. Well, I can't speak to that. I'm just telling you that the town is a utility provider. We don't sell for fracking.
I'm the mystery environmentalist from Table 5. And I just wanted to comment back to the bluegrass and the kids and their experience to the outdoors. Yeah, there's Bill Miller laughing. If the kids are going to experience outdoors, they need to see bugs and grubs, and they need to see weeds. Okay, so I don't believe that just having green grass, which probably won't have any weeds in it anyway, is a sufficient environmental experience. We need along the rivers, along the river banks and that sort of thing, a lot of native plants and animals for them, sorry.
If they want to see weeds and bluegrass, they can come to my yard. I can promise you that. That'd be beneficial. And I echo what you're talking about. I remember growing up in Arvada before I moved to Greeley, and wow, did we catch a lot of crawdads and water skippers and things along those lines, and had an incredible time with the natural environment from that standpoint.
Hi, my name is Kate. I am wondering if if any cities offer incentives to switch from animal agriculture to plant-based agriculture, and yeah, if that's even been considered.
Hasn't. I'll talk to you over a beer.
I'll also talk to you over a beer.
Shane and I will talk to anybody over a beer, just so you know.
So it's subliminal message that it's beer time. We're going to allow one more question before beer time.
I'll make it quick. My name is April. I'm from Southern California, and I want to know about the percentages of zero landscaping that the city has thought or anticipated to have throughout the community. And my second part of my question is, how much thought has gone into increased climate control and pollution zero landscaping will have over traditional?
Sean Chambers. I'll call my water and sewer director up and throw him in front of these. These are all a part of the analysis that we are doing in our long-term water planning efforts, and does entail a lot of research. One thing that I know when I started my career down in Florida, I'm proud to be a CSU grad. I'm proud of the research that's been done in xeric landscaping from CSU, and I think we should continue to engage with my alma mater in that regard to help us understand the benefits towards a xeric landscape in our communities. There is one point that I would make, is I know we need to have some shade, things along those lines in our neighborhoods, in our communities. It's hotter when you have asphalt and things like that are necessary for us to travel around, and having shade and things to that extent through trees, et cetera, is an important amenity that needs to be in our communities. So that's part of what we need to balance here, I think. Sean?
Yeah, good afternoon. appreciate the question about climate change. I think that's what I understood. And to Roy's point, there's a lot of complexity in modeling climate change in terms of the change in temperature and whether or not there's any change to precipitation. So we look at a lot of variable futures and what those futures are in terms of how quickly the snowmelt comes off and how that affects outdoor irrigated areas and how it affects trees and our urban landscape. So we're trying to plan for that, and then we're also really looking closely at conservation, looking at demand management, and trying to be really careful about how we utilize the water resources we have today and how we utilize water resources we may acquire into the future.
I think there's a one good question that we struggle with right now to help answer that water use on turf, because there is a benefit to turf from a reduced heat island effect. But what we struggle with is oftentimes those irrigation controllers, when we set up a new house, get set to overwater the new sod because it's new sod and it needs more water, and they never get touched again. And so we are constantly trying to educate our homeowners on working with your irrigation controller and actually setting it for the actual amount of water that your lawn needs. And it is something you should manage and not something you just kind of ignore and set out there and just let run, because we see a lot of overuse of irrigation water sometimes.
Let's give our panelists another round of applause. Thank you.
All right, so I hope today's program has answered some of your questions about the Poudre puzzles and also posed some more questions for you to ponder. And thank you for coming. We really appreciate it.